Welcome to the Politics Guys interview, conversations about American politics, economics, history, and culture with authors and researchers from across the ideological spectrum. I'm Michael Baranowski, a political scientist at Northern Kentucky University. My guest today is cybersecurity expert Sami Saydjari. He's been deeply involved in the field for over 3 decades, working for organizations including the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, the National Security Agency, and NASA, among others. He's published numerous papers, consulted national leaders on cybersecurity policy, and educated the public through interviews with national media, including CNN, PBS, ABC, the New York Times, Financial Times, the Wall Street Journal, and Time Magazine. He's also the author of the recently published book, Engineering Trustworthy Systems, Get Cybersecurity Design Right the First Time. Sami Saydjari, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Nice to be here.
With the 2018 midterm elections coming up very quickly, I think really the place to start here would be to ask you about election system security. Currently, according to the stats I've seen, around one in 5 voters across the United States uses an electronic voting system that doesn't include a paper trail. And so I'm wondering, how much of a security threat is this?
Well, I have a two-part answer. The electronic voting machines themselves are vulnerable to attack, but generally you have to be close to the machine. You have to get your hands on the machine. If an attacker can sort of access the machine, they can hack it. But getting close in access like that requires a lot of work, and requires you to do that while that somebody's supposed to be supervising the machines. So it's not easy. So I'd say the machines themselves, out of 10, I would say it's a 2 out of 10 in terms of the risk to the election. But when you ask the more general question of, is the election system secure, and you expand that to other kinds of parts of the election system as a whole, then I would say it's a very, very serious threat.
So when you say the other parts of the election system, I was hoping you could maybe expand on that, because I think when most people think about the system, they think about just those machines. So what are these other parts of the system that you think are at much greater risk than just those machines?
Well, so those machines have to then report the tally from each machine to some sort of aggregation system, something that sort of combines all those tallies together, right? That's a computer. And those aggregation regionally have to report up to state level, and that's another computer. And so you have computers talking to computers talking to computers, and every time it goes in between computers, the communications between the computers can be hacked, and the computers themselves can be hacked. So I think a much, much more concerning thing is the points of aggregation of these votes and the report out of these votes and the communication between these machines. I'd also add, the registration process is potentially hackable, so that people's data is not available, or people are dissuaded from registering. And the third category that I think is even more interesting and more concerning is what we call hacking wetware. And wetware is sort of the funny term that computer geeks use for human mind, the brain. Right, and so that's influencing people's votes.
And so, there are just a bunch of questions occur to me, but I think that the first one is that, you mentioned that whenever these systems talk to other systems, when you take the individual voting machines and then have those things tallied up. Now, I've heard one state election official, I think it was maybe in Georgia, who said, well, that's not actually a problem for us because our system is, and I think the term he used was air-gapped. And I understood that to mean that there's no actual direct connection to the internet. And he seemed to be implying that, well, because of that, then hackers had no way to get at that system. Is that more or less accurate?
Well, so your interpretation of the word air-gapped is exactly correct. And his viewpoint on the protection that air-gap provides for him is absolutely incorrect.
Okay.
Right, which is that all computers are connected in some way at some point in time. So, for example, those voting machines or their computers have software on them. Where was that software developed, right? It was developed on somebody else's computer. And how was that software loaded? Well, it was connected, probably by a network connection, to that computer. And what happens when the software has a bug in it? There's probably a maintenance port that somebody can call into or plug into to fix that bug. So the computers are intermittently connected all of the time. And so they're vulnerable when they're connected. And they're vulnerable, for example, let's say they just need to update the software to make it better. Well, where do you think that comes from, right? It comes from another computer that then loads it onto a thumb drive or connected by the internet and loads it up. So it's always connected, even though it appears to be air gapped. It's never air gapped all the time.
Okay. That and now the other thing you mentioned was the voter registration systems, and I'm guessing that it seems like there's been almost no attention paid, at least in the popular media, to the security of these systems, which makes me wonder if, maybe they're even less secure than the actual vote counting systems.
Yeah, well, I think that's a very reasonable conclusion. So I think the problem here is that there are no standards for protecting the election system as a whole and the registration system in particular. So, maybe some are slightly more secure than others, but as a whole, I would guess that they're much more likely to be vulnerable than protected because it's not gotten a lot of attention and there's no standards that they have to adhere to. And we find that when there's no standards, people do the cheap and easy thing as opposed to assess the risk to the registration process and assess the risks for systems that are connected to those systems, which is another potential problem.
Right. Now, and I know in a lot of systems that everyday people use now, they've moved to something called, is it two-factor authentication, where you get a code or something like that on your phone and things like that. And I'm wondering if that's the sort of thing that we need to move to, say, for election systems, so someone can't, for instance, get a password through some sort of a phishing scheme or something like that, and then use that to infiltrate that system.
Certainly. I mean, that's one of many things that we would have to do for all aspects of the voting system, registration, voting itself, particularly for those who have access to the systems, what I call sort of systems administrator access, those who update the system, those who manage the software, those who operate that software. Yes, they should at least do two-factor, if not three-factor authentication.
And so is it even is it possible even to have systems in this day and age that are maybe not 100% invulnerable, but let's say, 99.97% invulnerable? Or is that just unrealistic given how connected and networked systems are these days?
Well, so it's sort of like asking, can you make a house 100% or 99.9% fireproof? The answer is, well, yeah, you could, right? But the house would be so expensive and nobody would want to live in it.
Right.
So I think the same thing is true of cyberspace. Is you can't make it 100% or even 99.9%. But you can certainly do a heck of a lot better than is done today. It's a question of probability. So the key is really to make it too expensive and too risky for attackers to attack your system, so they go elsewhere.
And so, based on what you've seen and read and know about these election systems in general, what would you say are really the key steps that government agencies need to take to make their systems, if it's not 100%, I guess something over probably 90% certainly secure would be good. I mean, what sort of things would you recommend?
So the first thing I'd recommend is to do a risk assessment to determine the stakes. What can be done, right? So we don't exactly know the vulnerability of the registration system because nobody's done a risk assessment on it. We don't know the risks of all of the voting machines and the aggregators because nobody's done a risk assessment. So step one is to understand the degree and the source of where the risk comes from. Step two is to design a security architecture to mitigate those risks. So what do we need to put in place? What technology, what processes, what techniques, like your suggestion of a two-factor authentication or even three-factor. And then once we've got a security architecture, let's put something in place to monitor operations to make sure that, with all those defenses, somebody doesn't get in. And if they do, we know that they got in so we can push them out, or at least know that that voting system is compromised and we need to go fix it or update it.
Right. So it sounds like the situation is, it's one thing, I guess, to know that you're vulnerable, know what your vulnerabilities are, but it sounds like in many cases in our voting system, we're not even there. We don't even know the ways in which it's vulnerable, which to me sounds considerably scarier, actually.
Yes, right. Uncertainty is very scary.
Yeah.
And I think this is true of multiple infrastructures across the United States. You have talking heads giving testimony to Congress that say, it's not as bad as these security weenies say it is. They're just trying to say it's bad so they can get more money, which, maybe is true sometimes, right? But the reality is that the talking heads sometimes just make stuff up. And what we really need to do is to have a scientific engineering process to really deeply understand the nature of the threats of all infrastructures, including the election system.
Right. And I guess part of the problem here, at least when we're talking about voting systems, is, of course, voting systems, they're not centralized in any way. There'd have to be decisions made to do this in essentially every state. And so this is a case where I generally think where systems are sort of distributed, then that's a protection if there's a lot of, individual nodes. But here it's actually in coming to some sort of a solution, it might make things considerably more difficult.
You mean distributing the function has both positives and benefits. The positive is it can be much harder for the attacker to attack it. The negative is it can be much harder to defend the system. Right. With all of those distributed points.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was trying to say, at least. So yeah, you mentioned infrastructure, and I wanted to ask you about that as well. It wasn't. I think maybe just a few weeks ago, I seem to recall the Secretary of Homeland Security saying that cyber attacks were now, in her view, a greater threat than physical attacks on United States infrastructure. And I've read a little science fiction, and I come across occasionally these truly apocalyptic scenarios where you have these terrorists hacking into, the power grid, traffic control systems, emergency response systems, which essentially just paralyzes, cities, regions, maybe even the entire country. And whenever I see these things, I think, is that realistic? Could a dedicated team of well-resourced hackers do that? What do you think?
The short answer to that question is absolutely. It's quite plausible, and it's scary that I have to say yes to this, particularly after a couple of decades of attempting policy changes to try to have the government invest properly to defend the cyberspace grid. It's scary that we're still in this position, and it's probably worse now than it was 15, 20 years ago when the government started to wake up to the need to do these things. But for sure, right, I mean, the secretary is correct. You throw a pipe bomb in some part of our infrastructure, it creates an annoyance. But if you do a cyber attack that attacks all the generators across the United States, that's not an annoyance anymore. And our analysis, I did a similar kind of analysis and scenario for at the request of the National Security Council back about 10 years ago with a group of about 10 colleagues, scientists and engineers. And our conclusion was that national sovereignty was at stake. That's how bad can get.
Wow. Yeah, that's pretty bad. And is the reason why it's getting worse is the reason that things are just so much more connected than they were even 10, 15 years ago? Are there other factors at play?
That's definitely one of them. The interconnectedness is definitely creates what we call a larger attack surface for the adversary. But there's other things at play here. So we have this sort of just-in-time manufacturing notion where every system now, you don't warehouse anything, right? And so everything comes to you just when you need it. And what that means, it creates a tremendous efficiency in the economy, saves a lot of money, but it creates a brittleness because if you break a system that supplies stuff to you, then you're dead in the water because you don't get that stuff. So the just-in-time everything kind of integration of our commercial sector is another part of the problem. And I guess the third part I would say is we have increased our dependency on computers, not just the interconnectedness, but 50 years ago, it would be very difficult to bring the power grid down by a cyber attack because they weren't connected to anything. You would have to go kind of hook up to 50 or 100 different places, and you'd have to figure the system out, and then you'd have to do it. Now, most of the power grid is connected to the internet in some way. And so it's very plausible today because of the interconnectedness and the dependencies that we have on the computers to launch these kind of attacks.
Yeah. Well, it seems, I guess, in one level, it seems difficult for me to believe that, for instance, if you're somebody who has access to one of these systems, that you would click on a suspicious link, or that all of these systems wouldn't have 2 or 3 factor authentication. I mean, that doesn't seem to me to be the sort of thing that would cost a ton of money to implement. But I'm guessing that a lot of systems that are fairly critical might not be that well protected even.
Yes, you're right. So part of the problem is, let me just take the power grid, for example. The technology doesn't have integrated security yet because nobody's demanded it yet. And so, you talk to the people who buy this equipment, they say, we'd love to buy the equipment that has more security in it, but nobody's selling it because there's no incentive to do so. And this is the problem here is that the risk is not to the power company. The risk is to society. And so if the power goes down, the power company goes, yeah, I did my best, right? And I don't want to raise the cost of power 3 cents, per kilowatt because, we'd get a lot of complaints. And so we don't want to do that. Our customers don't want us to do that. And it's what we call a tragedy of the commons, right? Nobody wants to pay for it until the power grid goes down for 6 months. And then we all go, gee, I wish we paid for that.
Yeah.
So we need to create incentives and some government policy that really improve this situation.
Do you have any thoughts as to what that might involve? Because that sounds like a really good idea to me, certainly.
Yeah, I think the first one is to stop the talking heads war, right? So we need to settle the issue. Is Sami right that this is an existential threat to the sovereignty of the United States? If I am, we are crazily underinvesting in this problem, right? We are crazily exposing ourselves, our country, to very, very serious damages. And if I'm wrong, then we should set people like me up, right? But we need to settle this, right? And we need sort of like a panel at the national level to settle this question, because we can't just have, you can always find some talking head to say this problem is overblown. But most of the professionals in the field will tell you this is a very, very, very serious problem. And so we have to face this tragedy of the commons problem. And we have to sort of subsidize the risk, the handling of the risk, right? We can expect companies to handle ordinary threats, right? But when we talk about extraordinary threats, like from nation states like Russia or China, we have to find a way to help them defend themselves and sort of use a societal investment to defend the infrastructure that we all depend on.
Right. Yeah, I think maybe in part why some people think that there's not that serious of a threat is they often feel like, well, if there were such a big threat and we were so vulnerable, certainly by now the North Koreans, the Russians, the Chinese would have done something truly significant. And the fact that they haven't suggests that, while we could use some work, we're probably okay.
Right. By that logic, right, we would say, we really haven't had a nuclear weapon go off in the United States, So we really don't need all of this, protection, right? So the other thing I'd point out about this is that a lot of these strategic weapons are one-time use, right? So if you attack the power grid of the United States, let's just say somebody wanted to just hurt us, right? And they brought our power grid down for 2 weeks in, let's say, New York City. Well, the problem with that is we would see how vulnerable our system was and we'd start scurrying to make the investment. It's much better to put those kind of attacks deeply buried into the system and use them only when you really need to, when you're in a strategic conflict with that country, not willy-nilly. So I think we should assume that there are attacks that are buried deep inside of all of our infrastructure, ready to be triggered at any moment.
Wow, well, that's a truly scary sort of scenario. Well, how about our military systems? I mean, that would be even, some people would argue, even a scarier potential threat if terrorists or, again, nation states got into our GPS, military communications, even nuclear systems. Now, I'm hoping that you're going to tell me that our military systems are super hardened, nearly impenetrable, given how incredibly vital and potentially destructive they are. So are you going to tell me that?
I would love to tell you that.
Yeah, I'd love to hear it.
No, I mean, so look, I think our military systems are in general much better protected than our civilian systems are. The military has understood this problem for decades longer than the civilian side has, and they have a much more sophisticated understanding of this problem. But they also have a very complex, interconnected, interdependent set of systems that are very difficult to analyze and very, very difficult to protect because it's scattered across the entire globe. And the consequences of somebody taking control of a military system, let's say a weapons delivery system in a battlefield, would turn the power of the United States arsenal against the United States. And so that is extremely concerning. And so if you ask me, are we doing enough to protect our military? The answer is no. Could we do better? Yes. Are we doing okay? On average, the military does a decent job, but they still have gaps. They still have ways they can do better. And there's still places where maybe the attacker could harm us in ways that we really don't need to be that vulnerable if we just reallocated some resources.
Right. So I guess the true nightmare scenario would be a coordinated attack where, say, Russia or China or someone like that would essentially go, would launch those little time bombs essentially implanted in our civilian systems, and at the same time, exploit any vulnerabilities in the military systems all at once, and then that could cause just incredible chaos.
Yeah, absolutely. That kind of coordinated attack would be very serious. But I'd also say that the military often thinks about defending against cyber attack as defending against a cyber attack on the military. And that's a little bit like our immunity system deciding that its priority in defending the body is defending the immunity system, right? Yeah. That's nice, right? But what about the heart and the brain and all these other critical systems? So, if you think about the art of war, Sun Tzu, who has taught, has talked about, who wrote this thousands of years ago, you attack somebody by attacking the part that's easiest, right? You don't go after our military. You go after the soft underbelly. You go after the civilian infrastructure, and you take your time. You do it slowly. And you'll never need to attack the military, right? If you take out the power grid of the United States and you take it down for 6 months and you do so with 70% of the infrastructure gone, what is the military going to defend against? Yeah. Who are they protecting at that point? So you may not even need to attack the military. So yes, they should be well defended, but it may not be the relevant thing.
I guess I've just always sort of assumed in the back of my mind that in some deep, dark bunker somewhere in, I don't know, Northern Virginia or something like that, that there were people who were wargaming all this stuff out and that had contingency plans and backup systems and all that. Now, obviously, I'm not an expert in this field, and you are with a lot of expertise. So do you think that that's going on? I mean, is that an unreasonable expectation?
No, certainly it's going on, right? I mean, so the the question is not whether the government is interested and concerned about this problem. They are, and there's a lot of our leaders that are deeply concerned. And yes, I have been involved in a number of what we call tabletop exercises to look at what bad scenarios can happen and what the government might do about them. But the reality is that if a major attack happened of the sort you described, where they're attacking our power grid, and they're attacking our banks, and they're attacking our telecommunication systems, and attacking our military simultaneously, that would overwhelm our ability right now, because we don't have the protective infrastructure to stop all of that in real time. So it was not like we're doing nothing, but when we look at that kind of complex attack, strategic attack against the United States, we are ill prepared.
Do you have a sense of what we're doing relative to, say, other countries? Because I'm wondering if everyone is pretty much vulnerable, or if maybe we're just for some reason particularly blind to this, or less, less proactive in this in the United States, and maybe other countries are.
Well, I'd say like one of the most invulnerable countries to this might be something like Afghanistan.
Sure.
And you might think that's funny, right? But it's because they have no electronic infrastructure anymore, right? And so the reason why the United States is asymmetrically vulnerable or unusually vulnerable is because we are an advanced country, a first world country with tremendous dependency on our information infrastructure. And so do other countries have this vulnerability? Yes, to the extent that they depend on their infrastructure. Do some countries do better than we do, even with that kind of infrastructure? The answer is yes. China is investing a substantial amount in protecting their information infrastructure and have a strategic interest in both the defense and offense in cyberspace. They have a strategic goal of dominating cyberspace by 2050, and they are well on their way. We don't have a similar goal.
Wow, that's unsettling to say the least. But it seems to me that this is a problem that's likely to get worse than over time, just simply because as we become more interconnected. I mean, it's an ongoing battle between the people designing secure systems and the people seeking to exploit them. But it seems to me that just as a general rule, the more complex you make any system, the more vulnerable it is to attack, other things being equal. And so I'm wondering if we're just going to see even more of this in the future.
Yes, if I could stand up and applaud that line, I would. Yes, complexity equals vulnerability. I mean, that pure and simple. And our systems are getting extremely complex, and extremely interdependent. So yeah, I think you're absolutely right that the vulnerability is growing, and the other thing that's growing is the sophistication of attackers. They're becoming much better, much smarter, and they're building off the successes of their predecessors. And so the attack technology is improving tremendously. And as we develop defenses, it sort of pushes them to develop their attack technology to adapt to our defenses, which we then have to adapt to. So it's kind of like an arms race or a space race in cyberspace, and it will always be. We will never get to a point where we've got defenses and there is no way to attack the defenses. So it'll always be an arms race.
Right. Well, I have just one final question for you. Now, as I'm sure you know, the Trump administration not too long ago eliminated the position of National Cybersecurity Coordinator. But let's say that position did exist, and you were in that position advising the administration on cybersecurity. What would the one thing that you would want to tell the administration to do? What would your top recommendation be?
Well, first, let me clarify something, because the administration eliminated a national cybersecurity coordinator, but there's actually multiple positions, and they have a significant presence in the National Security Council on cyber. So I don't know that I would take that move to indicate a lack of interest.
Okay.
They are interested. But to answer your question directly, I would first perform a national level risk assessment of all of our infrastructures to see where the risks are, and including the election systems, which you opened up with. And then I would develop an investment plan to mitigate those risks. to see, including a vigorous research and development program to say, okay, what can we do about this under the constraints of the fact that we're a democracy and a lot of it's owned by the private sector? What can we reasonably do to mitigate the risks that we now understand and all agree on? And then I would focus the cybersecurity work in the government because it's kind of discombobulated. There's 50 or 100 different cybersecurity investments. I would try to get that focused into kind of a Manhattan Project-like activity to get the smartest minds, the best people together to address this problem and do it in a way that is really, really thought out and strategic, because a whole bunch of small efforts that are in different directions is not going to solve this problem. We've been trying that for 20 years. It's failed for 20 years. We need a concerted effort.
Well, those all sound like extremely wise recommendations. And with those recommendations, we will close. Sami, Saydjari, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me today.
You're welcome. It was my great pleasure. Thank you.
That's it for this episode. Thanks for listening. Support from listeners just like you is what keeps the show going, and we truly do appreciate it. If you're interested in joining our great group of Politics Guys supporters, you can go to politicsguys.com and click on the Patreon or PayPal links you'll see there. And if you want to support the show without spending anything, you can subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, Pocket Cast, Stitcher, or whatever other podcast app you use. Share this episode with your friends and followers, and pass along our new show posts and tweets on Facebook and Twitter. Leaving reviews and ratings on iTunes also helps. If you've got a question, comment, correction, or just a random thought you want to share with us, you can reach us at mail@politicsguys.com. Our Facebook page, where you can message us and where we post things throughout the week, is facebook.com/politicsguyspage. We're also on Twitter @politicsguys. The executive producers of the Politics Guys are Michael Baranowski, Jay Carson, Trey Orndorff, and Bruce Johnson. Today's show was produced by Michael Baranowski. We'll be back with a new show on Saturday. We hope you'll join us.